Welcome to UberCube, the podcast where we discuss all things cube, but with refreshments. This is your host, Anthony Adams, a.k.a. UberBear, and I am joined by my other host,
Stu. Thanks for joining us.
All right, so we're going to do an interesting topic for you guys this evening, and it's going to be about... We're going to call it Super Friends or Planeswalkers within your cube environment.
So, like, Super Friends is pretty
it's very Justice League.
Yeah, it's well known.
Right. But what we're leaning into is kind of, I had to educate myself on the way here, you know. And I like many people, I'm not a lore person. I've never claimed to be.
Same.
But I do think it's interesting how basically Planeswalkers came to be. So my understanding, and feel free to come at me, but they have an innate spark.
Okay.
It's an unknown spark. They're just from birth. They have an ability that hasn't quite come to fruition. And through some kind of tragedy or heroic intervention or some kind of cataclysmic event, the spark comes to life, and then they become the said Planeswalker.
Okay.
And that's when that ability gains, right? And then once they have that, they now have the ability, again, forgive me, they have the ability now to travel the multiverse via the blind eternities. That's kind of we'll call that the Uber or the subway system for the multiverse, right? Right. And we've got, this is a super relevant conversation because now we're moving into a new set coming out soon. It's the Phyrexia, All is One, right? Did I say that correctly?
That's right, all is one.
And what the Phyrexians have basically suffered, again, forgive me for not knowing all the things and stuff about the lore, but when they've tried to move through, I guess, the blind eternities via portal, they've lost some of their flesh. It's basically, you're getting destroyed by actually traveling.
What happens, and is there by any chance a keyword that explains what happens when they lose some flesh?
Completed?
Wow.
It seems like, so Stu and I were talking about this, we're pre-gaming a little bit. Completed seems like the opposite of what's happening. It seems more like incompleted or maybe corrupted, right?
Corrupted.
These
corrupted.
But we're going to go with completed. And I think we're saying that right. We were even talking about the enunciation of the word.
Correct.
Is it completed? Completed? We don't know. But that's not what we do here at UberCube. So before we get into this topic about these super friends, we're going to do the thing that we always do here, and we're going to enjoy our libations of the show.
Anthony, what you drinking tonight?
I am having an Appalachian Mountain Brewery Longleaf IPA, and it is a kind of a local-esque out of Ashboro, and I am looking forward to drinking this. So how about yourself, Stu?
I am drinking a New Belgium Voodoo Vice IPA. It's delicious.
We talked about it before. Is that with the skeleton of the Testarossa?
We have, but the reason why I like this one so much is because look at that. I don't know if anyone else is drinking one of these right now, but if you are, you can see this one's got Michael Jackson on the can.
That is straight, straight up. Yeah, that's a smooth criminal.
It's smooth criminal in zombie form.
Very cool.
With a Hawaiian shirt on.
All right, so let's go ahead and crack these bad boys up and get to the topic. All right, so as we talked about before in our introduction, again, I am not a lore specialist. I enjoy the game of Magic. I love it. But I just find the lore sometimes interesting. And we're going to talk about today the Super Friends as an archetype. So, Stu, what is Super Friends and what would you define that as?
So, we've talked about Super Friends being the Planeswalkers, right? I think that's kind of a fairly common term among the Magic community. Like, Super Friends are generally considered to be like the Planeswalkers. So, the Super Friends archetype, for example, can be a deck that typically revolves or relies heavily upon the Planeswalkers that exist within it for whatever reason. Either it's supplies some control aspects. Typically, I would say for the most part, a lot of the constructed decks, even a lot of the, not just 60-card constructed decks, but also EDH decks, typically provide a fair amount of control, but there's a whole suite of abilities, and basically Planeswalkers, they really can do anything, right? They can control the board, they can provide tempo, they can reduce abilities, untap lands, the whole 9 yards.
So sometimes a Planeswalker will try to carry you to the finish line either through the control aspects, basically out-tempoing or out-resourcing. They're basically stalling the game. Or the other type is they're racing towards an ultimate of some kind. And the ultimate can be game-ending. And if you don't stop it, you now have very limited amount of turns to actually deal with taking out the player, no longer the Planeswalker. Yep. So also the Super Friends, the package will consist of a lot of sweepers, or wraths, if you want to call them that, and other trigger control speed or other removal control pieces, to add to that suite to ensure the other player can't touch the planeswalkers as they're either going up and down on their loyalty.
I think certainly depending on the deck that you are building, drafting, whatever the case may be, we're going to certainly get into that as this episode progresses. But I will say certainly, given sort of the discussion that we've had before discussing this episode, it is quite incredible the breadth of capabilities that you can use Planeswalkers for.
And we can't talk about Planeswalkers, Stu, without talking about the Lorwyn 5. This is the first 5, and they came out, when Lorwyn came out, right?
That's
and these were game-changing. This was a complete, when I say game-changing, they were literally reinvented the game of Magic in so many ways. It was divisive. People didn't know what to do with them.
People still don't like them.
Yeah, there's people that don't like them. You may hear some of that tone as we go throughout our conversation today. There's going to be a little bit of love and a little bit of hate for them. Mm-hmm. And so let's talk about it. So this is going to be a very show notes centered conversation, right? Because for everyone that has seen the Planeswalkers, most of them are going to have a minimum of 3 abilities.
A lot of text.
A lot of text, right? And this could be the 15-hour episode of UberCube, or we could really get to the brass tacks of the conversation. So let's talk about the Lorwyn 5.
Right. So it's Garruk. Is it Garruk or Garuk?
It's Garruk, is how I pronounce it, the Wild Speaker.
I like Garruk as well.
Yeah.
Garruk Wild Speaker, Chandra Nala, Ajani Goldmane, Liliana Vess, and Jace Beleren. Those are your Lorwyn 5.
There are your Lorwyn 5. So of these 5, during that time period, some of them saw constructed play during that period, especially like Chandra did. And this may have been during standard times, whatever Garruk did and Jace did. But let's talk about the 2 out of the Lorwyn 5. And then later, the 1 that later still remained. It's held on tightly ever since Lorwyn came out, and they're still found in cubes. And this one was Garruk, the Wild Speaker, and Jace Beleren for different reasons.
No love for Ajani Goldmane? Just a little bit? I can definitely understand Chandra Nala, and I can definitely understand Liliana Vess, but I kind of feel like Ajani Goldmane has a bit of a place in there.
It certainly does.
He's only 4 mana, and the other 2 are 5. And he has a relevant ability with the +1/+1 counters on each creature you control, gaining vigilance until end of turn. Pretty strong.
Yes, and as we do this conversation, so at UberCube, we've never emphasized a power level of a cube, right?
100%.
So we're going to be all over the spectrum here. So in a power, we're going to say the highest tier of power, and I know power is a highly subjective, let's just say a very strong, the upper echelon of the Magic game,
correct,
right, type of cube. Garruk Wild Speaker has been the one that has held out the longest of the 5, right? And I'll read that card to you because it's relevant. And what makes it so unique and relevant and still pertinent today is because of this. Garruk the Wild Speaker, for 2 colorless and 2 forest, you get a 3 loyalty Planeswalker Garruk. And its +1 ability, untap 2 target lands. And then its -1 ability is put a 3/3 green beast creature token into play. And then its -4 ability, or on its loyalty counters, is creatures you control get +3/+3 and gain trample until the end of turn. Stu,
think about what this would have looked like to someone who started playing Magic, 25 years ago, where right now we're looking at creatures, for example, that are like 4/4 trample and they cost 3 mana, or, we look at some of these undercosted creatures, right? Now you only have to spend 4 mana to pretty much, if it lands, you get a 3/3 right away. And then you've still got a Planeswalker that you've got to deal with, right? Kind of as maybe a little bit of an offset to this conversation, but it kind of goes to show how powerful these are historically compared to some of the earlier Magic cards.
Now, of these 5, and I do, and so each one of these and every one of these has a cube for them. Let's just start there, right? Mm-hmm. But we'll use my powered vintage 540 that I have, and then there'll be others we're going to reference here shortly, or at least ones that are of the highest power. They're pushing the levels. We said the upper echelon, whatever you want to call it, top tier Magic. Mm-hmm. Garruk is the one that has the 3 abilities that are pertinent. All 3 of them hit the game. And it comes out the ground running. It does something for multiple archetypes.
Agreed.
And we're going to talk about what makes this card so unique compared to the other 5. The second place one, and I'll give this one an honorable mention, is Jace Beleren.
Yes, agreed.
He has a place in a cube environment that I have that we will talk about here shortly, because that interesting ability to net cards and then choose whenever you want to give the opponent card back and forth, it is relevant.
He's been superseded,
in
my opinion.
He has.
There is a Planeswalker that I'm pretty confident that I'm going to at least honorable mention later in the episode, but definitely still has a place.
But we will give one little thing here. in a 1v1 environment is this evaluation. We're going to talk about multiplayer environments here shortly, and it changes the game on how you evaluate these cards, but I don't want to go into that too far because we're getting ahead of ourselves here at UberCube. All right, so we've kind of talked about, so Grook, he still resides in a lot of cubes, still very predominant, does a lot of things. So. Oh, yeah, and it can survive in multiplayer environments. I mean, it's just a powerful card.
Because here's the other thing as well, right? If you have Garruk, whatever you want to say, you pay 2 colors and 2 forests.
We don't need no water.
You untap 2 lands. You know what you can do with those 2 forests? You can play a Colonian Tusker.
Yes, you can. And then you have, what is that, 3/3 also?
I'm going to drop that in there every opportunity, and you know it.
All right, moving on. So we've talked about Lore 1-5 and where they stand, right? So then I'm gonna put a very straightforward question out there to the universe. I'm gonna ask Stu, in his opinion, he may not have been ready for this. I put the best Planeswalker of all time, but how about your favorite Planeswalker? It's probably a better way of saying it.
Do you want to say my favorite, or do you want to say the best?
Whichever you choose.
I don't know if this is... I'm actually going to say that my best may be tied, okay? But I also want to say that I think I need to mention one Planeswalker first. But I might say that the best Planeswalker of all time is going to be Jace the Mind Sculptor. Because I don't know if a single Planeswalker card has had such an impact on the entire Magic the Gathering environment like Jace did. Okay? He was banned from Modern. He was a powerhouse in all of the constructed formats at some point, right? I'm pretty sure he was powerful in Vintage, definitely in Legacy, and most certainly in Modern for the short time that he was legal there. I know this is cube-centric, and I certainly will acknowledge that Jace the Mind Sculptor is not quite as powerful in a cube environment, but if we're just talking the best, I think Jace needs a mention. But this is 2023. This is when we're recording, okay? So now times have changed. And I think there have been a few Planeswalkers that have been printed very recently that are just absolutely bonkers. The first one I'm going to mention is Renin 6. It's a 2-mana Planeswalker that maybe not necessarily in a cube environment, but certainly in some of the 60-card constructed environments has caused some major problems with 1-toughness creatures. The fact that it comes down, you can bring a land card back from your graveyard, which makes fetch lands increasingly powerful. It just makes it absolutely bonkers. And the ultimate is no slouch either. So Renin 6 is going to be at least up there. And my second one is going to be Mini Teferi Time Raveler.
Mm-hmm. Can't argue.
It's just absolutely nuts how powerful this Planeswalker is, that for 3 mana, you can either bounce something back to your opponent's hand, bounce something back to your hand, and draw a card, or decide that you want to play sorceries at instant speed until your next turn, and you jump it up to 4 loyalty, which in a lot of constructed formats, you know, in a world, again, this is 2023, in early turns where you're looking at things like, you know, Delver or, you know, DRC, right? Dragon's Rage Channeler, to be able to bump a Planeswalker up to 4 loyalty very, very quickly is just absolutely insane to me. So, you know, again, this is 2023. There's so many Planeswalkers are out there, but I'm going to say Jace the Mind Sculptor historically, but right now, Mini Teferi, Renin 6. Anthony, tell me what you got.
Mine's going to be somewhat controversial. It's going to be both a favorite and slightly underappreciated and exceptionally powerful.
Before you answer, I want to ask a question.
Mm-hmm.
I want you to tell me what your motivation is for choosing this card. Is it purely as we are a cube podcast? Is this the best cube Planeswalker, or is this just the best Planeswalker?
A little bit of both.
Okay,
there's a lot of spice and a lot of things here that this card does.
Okay.
That maybe gets overlooked based on time, right?
What you got?
And it's going to be a Johnny Vengeant.
Okay, not interesting choice.
Yes, and for 2 colorless and Boros, you get a Planeswalker, a Johnny. It starts out with 3 loyalty. +1, target permanent doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. Permanent. Let's just start there.
Okay.
And secondly, his next ability is the -2. A Johnny Vengeant deals 3 damage to target creature or player, and you gain 3 life. -7, destroy all lands target player controls. Now let me talk about each one of these effects and why this draws me in so much. Okay, so let's start out with Boros. Boros is it kind of doesn't fall into a control suite very often. There's a few cards out there that says, "Hey, I'm Boros, I'm control." The vast majority, it's very aggressive.
I would argue that white really does. I would argue that white is kind of like the yang to the blue yin of control.
Blue, yeah, sort of. But let's talk about this first piece. So that target permanent doesn't untap during its next untap.
That's very strong.
That is strong. I mean, that's permanent. You get land, so it acts as a Rashadan Port. It takes down a Soul Ring. It takes down a creature. It very much stymies. It protects itself, right? That one mode protects itself and or cuts off resources for the person coming at it, right? Sure. So you can stymie their game. The next one takes out any immediate threats, including player removal, right? And stabilizes. So it's a tit for tat. I hit you for 3, I gain 3. So I'm netting a virtual 6.
A swing for 6 is
it's a swing for 6, and it's on there for just basically taking it down to 1. So you're going to start being motivated to taking them down again.
Sure.
Right? And then the ultimate is pretty much it's not necessarily the end of the game because it doesn't take out their permanents, but it just does a really unique Armageddon type effect that puts a clock on them that they must get their artifacts out and their creatures out. And then whilst doing all that, you're taking out their permanents that they're attempting to stabilize with. The signets. You're taking down their pieces. This card is underappreciated, very powerful, and it's kind of went the way of the dodo in a lot of cube environments. I'm one of those holdouts for this card because for 4 mana, this does so much that emulates kind of we'll say a Frost Titan type effect. It does kind of a lightning helix type of effect.
Exactly.
And then it also does a Rashadan Port and emulates an Armageddon, but a one-sided Armageddon or Ravagers of War.
It's a good card.
It is powerful. And granted, it's not to today's standards where you're paying that 4 for 3 on loyalty, but
I'm gonna say I don't think it's the best Planeswalker of all time. If that's the
most underappreciated best Planeswalker. I know there's a lot of them out here, but this thing, let me read it. 3 damage, start creature or player is problematic. If this was printed now, it may say any permanent or any target, rather.
Yeah.
And then it could be a Planeswalker killer. I know we're not there.
I think it's been outvalued in the last few years because I think obviously for 2 mana being able to recur lands from your graveyard.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Shut that was another thing I didn't mention about Teferi is that the +1 ability allows you to shut your opponents from playing anything at instant speed, which is just absurdly powerful, right?
Well, when this episode's over, my boy Johnny's going to drop me off a 20 for giving him a shout out, trying to get him back in cubes. But, the card's still good. It has value add. Boros is an interesting suite. If you're looking for something that does something a little bit spicy, this has got all the spice. All right, so let's kind of move over to, we've done our favorites, if you will.
Let's talk numbers.
So I did some quantitative analysis.
Okay.
And I went through and I selected, 10 to 15 cubes using Cube Cobra.
God bless Cube Cobra.
I just ran basically.
God bless Cube Cobra.
It is wonderful. And I ran, right. And I ran some numbers on, how many Planeswalkers are in different cubes of various sizes. I focused primarily on 360 and 540. And I wanted to I asked myself, what do I believe what's the average that I would see percentage-wise in the majority of cubes?
Okay.
And I did this I referenced my 540 powered vintage cube. I referenced the MTGO 540.
Okay.
Or the Moto. And I referenced Sandwich's 450. So I did go a little bit out of the box there. And then I actually did Chill MTG's Sol Cube.
Okay.
And we'll kind of talk about those more. But when I ran the numbers on their amounts of Planeswalkers at their various sizes, it was pretty consistent, and including the next 10 or so that I did of unnamed cubes, 5 to 7% of total amount was about the standing average.
I would love to hear back from other curators, right? Because we like to talk to people on the Twitters and the socials. Let's hear from you guys as well. 5 to 7%. Does that sound about what you guys have got in your cubes? Let's get some feedback on that as well. Let's get a conversation.
That represents like 28. It represents about 28 in my 540. And we've had a lot of play testing.
That is quite a small window as well.
Yes.
5 to 7%. And the fact that you've got a few cubes there and they are in such a small window, it's
tight.
It is tight.
And I random sampled about 10. I probably did more than that. But what I wanted to know was, what was the tipping point? And I'm not going this is going to be like, if you're familiar with the Unsolved Mysteries, the show.
I am.
The name literally told you when you started watching it, you're not going to solve it, right? I mean, you can sit there and watch the entire episode and go, well, damn
I think it was that guy.
I still don't know.
It was the
I have my suspicions. But so I wanted to kind of know, what was that threshold, right? And these cubes that I named, the specific 4, these have all been played tested, balanced, curated. So I have faith in these four. A lot of people have seen them.
They're not cubes that were created a week
And so
ago.
I asked myself, is there a number that was pertinent that you could put in a cube? Like, how many would you want before it was too many?
Sure.
Or if you had them at all, right? And I think a safe threshold, and this is just my personal opinion, I've always kind of counted. I've said, well, when I started getting around 30, I started thinking that's a lot of Planeswalkers. It was more of a, putting my thumb in the wind and seeing if there was airflow kind of thing. But I said 30 seems like a lot. So I kind of tweaked it back to 28. So I'm always mindful of that. When a new Planeswalker comes out and say it's Golgari, and I wanted to put another Golgari in there, sure, I'll swap them out one for one. I just don't add more and keep adding more. And we're going to talk about why that is. But I wanted the game to be very focused on a lot of different... I wanted to have an entire spectrum of Magic play and not sure, just kill the Planeswalker type sure, game, right? Okay. So that's kind of an overview. I would say comfortably based on what I've looked at. And I want to, like Stu said, I would love to hear your opinions. But I think the number 5 to 7% is mostly a very safe value if you're choosing to run them at all.
I would agree with that. Something that, there's decks, and, we don't talk about this too much, but for a commander, for example, there's decks out there that are very Super Friends centric, right? The decks are full of Planeswalkers, and the idea is that you're just going to, utilize your general, the fixing and all that, put a bunch of Planeswalkers out there. Obviously, if there's archetypes that exist whereby you want to put a bunch of Planeswalkers out there, you're doing so because they're generating value. They don't even have to generate value when they come down. There can be some persisting value, right? Or something that's like, man, I don't want to have to face that for much longer. Like, I want to put my creatures... maybe I don't even have any creatures, or maybe all the creatures that I've got, I need to now focus on this one threat. So, I like the numbers on that. And I'd be interested, like you said, to see how this lines up with other cubes, and certainly outside of the vintage cube environment, because like we talked about earlier, this isn't just a power cube thing, right? It's
a cube thing. And so I will put up a poll on Twitter, or rather I'll put up multiple social media questionnaires, and I kind of want to know a drill down of, without, I want your feedback on what you think is a safe number.
Start the conversation. Don't wait for us.
Right. So, which kind of what Stu said leads us into a couple of breakdowns here. So let's talk about the pros. And Stu, would you mind taking on these pros, and I'll kind of bounce in as needed? But I think you got a lot to say here, because I think I'm going to fall a little bit into the con shell here a little bit.
All right. So the pros, and the first point that you mentioned, control shell, right? And this fits perfectly with 3 fairy. Little Teferi, right? Teferi Time Raveler. About as good a control Planeswalker as you could want to prevent your opponent playing at instant speed. Gives you the ability to bounce a creature back to your opponent's hand and draw a card for only 3 mana, right? So when you think about other interactive spells that exist in the whole history of Magic, right? 3 mana to be able to do something that both gives you an immediate effect and a persistent effect. To me, that's kind of why I chose it as one of the most powerful. Like, that's pretty bonkers in a control shell, that you only have to spend 3 mana to be able to do something like that, right?
And I will interject again, because we talked about this in the beginning of the episode. Planeswalkers are littered with text. They're text walls.
Go read show notes.
Our show notes will include all of these. Please in addition to, you're more than welcome to take the names of the Planeswalkers we're saying. And I know I said 3 fairy, and you're like, what does 3 Teferi mean?
Teferi Time Raveler.
Exactly. You can scryfall this too. So exactly. I just want to make sure we're not losing the listeners out of respect. I understand the difficulty of trying to break down a Planeswalker, but in order to be snappy here at UberCube, we're just trying to keep a good flow. So I apologize for the minor interruption, but I feel it necessary. These are word walls, right?
No, 100%.
They're very old school Magic, but they're not.
I would agree. And certainly, I would hope, and I'm sure that there's plenty of very, very experienced cube curators that are listening to this podcast right now that are going to say, like, absolutely, I am very, very familiar with, not just Planeswalkers, but all of the cards that exist and have been printed, certainly in the last few years in Magic, but certainly for anyone who's maybe newer to Magic, or certainly newer to curating a cube and designing a cube, that is not a card that, and we talked about power level and just kind of throwing things in. Teferi Time Raveler is not just a Planeswalker that you throw into any cube because you're thinking, hey, I've got an Azorius control shell in my cube and this looks amazing. That card is bonkers powerful, be careful with it.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot of cards, and we'll move through them, and they'll be referenced once again in our show notes. But a lot of these, you could quote unquote call them fun, or you can call them oppressive.
Yes.
That seesaw is going to move tilt. Yeah, it's a scale, right? It depends on your definition of fun. Sure. But it is important that as a curator, to gauge the power of the Planeswalker. You may not be able to evaluate that yourself. So it's good to look to your peer group, social media, look out on different groups, chat forums, etc. You can join the UberCube Discord if you want to talk about these, and you go, hey, I got a great idea. I found this Teferi Time Reveler, and I want to put this in my, I want to downgrade it and put it in my peasant cube. What do you think? Right? And I make jokes, I make jests, but don't do it. That's right. You're like, but it is important because these can take over games. Even the ones that have the static effects are definitely, that's a new kind of creation since War of the Spark, where we started seeing not only Planeswalkers had loyalty triggers that counted through, and you could manage those, but some of them became more of a static, we'll call it a Planeswalker enchantment-ish, where it's always there.
Yeah, it's a
those abilities are just sitting there, causing drama for your opponents, etc. Like
some of them are very good.
And some of them are very bad.
Some of them are mediocre.
It's all over the spectrum. But
that one's bonkers.
But it changes the evaluation substantially on that card. If it didn't have that static effect, the card would change. It would just be a traditional draw card, bounce card type thing. Draw, go.
You are 100% correct. And that, like, to me, and I don't want to get hung up on just talking about this one card, but Teferi Time Raveler is really one of those, like, it's almost a case study in cards that there is absolutely no weakness to that card, at least when it lands, whatsoever, right? You can, if there's nothing on your opponent's board, you tick it up. If you're playing a control shell, now your opponent can't interact with you at instant speed. If your opponent has got a threat on the board, you land it, you bounce their threat back to their hand. Now it's an incredibly strong tempo play, and they have a Planeswalker on the battlefield that they need to deal with. And yeah, it might only have one loyalty after you've bounced it, but now that if they only have one creature, now you're not taking any damage. Sure, they get rid of your Planeswalker, but now you've bounced the threat. I don't want to say what I wanted because I'm going to save that for later, but now it's a whole extra turn until they can do something.
So Stu and I have brought Teferi home for supper at this point, right? And I think it's best that the audience now meets Teferi. And so Teferi, Time Raveler, one colorless, and Azorius, she had a legendary Planeswalker. Teferi, it starts out with four loyalty. Mm-hmm. It has a static effect of each opponent can cast spells only anytime they could cast a sorcery.
Each opponent. EDH players, take note.
EDH players take note. Multiplayer cubes, take note. Two-headed giant, this is oppressive. I won't run that in there.
Bonkers.
It's just literally stymieing. It depends on how you want your interaction to be. It literally scales with the volume of players, right? +1, until your next turn, you may cast sorcery spells as though they had flash. So it gives you, the player with the priority holding the Teferi, the ability to cheat around that and to play all of your spells significantly quicker.
Can you imagine 3 mana, play Teferi?
Yeah, you're tempoing them out of the game. I mean, they're just behind the clock now, right?
Yeah.
And then the -3, and this one's just kind of creates more of that drama. And this does lose some relevance as you transition into a multiplayer environment. It'll be -3, return up to 1 target artifact, creature, or enchantment to its owner's hand, and then draw a card. Really a period, not the word, and then.
Just bounce something, but you get to draw a card as well.
Yeah, so you're tempoing them out, you're card advantaging them. I can realize that one thing may not be as scalable into a multiplayer environment, but still people are going to want to come at you, so you better be prepared to defend it. Definitely. It is prepared, and now in a 1v1 scenario, now that we've brought Teferi to dinner, and it's become uncomfortable because, he's not only eating your lasagna, he's eating all of our lasagna, and we haven't even had a chance to see it because he's done it on our turn.
That's right.
I hate this card. I hate this card.
So good.
Buyer beware is all we're saying here, right? That was Stu's whole point. Is with cards like this, and there's a lot more. There's so many Planeswalkers that you're like, oh man, that seems pretty sick. I'm going to put Chandra, Torch of Defiance in my cube, right?
I think that's one of
the card can kill you. And it's not even a little bit, a lot.
I love that you mentioned that card because that was exactly what I was going to mention. When you're designing a cube, these are the kind of, it doesn't matter what kind of card it is. It doesn't matter if it's a creature or a sorcery or an instant or anything. But I kind of feel like Planeswalkers, if you're including them, we've talked about other cards in other episodes of UberCube where you can be like, man, you need to be kind of careful about putting this card in or that card in. I feel Planeswalkers are the absolutely most delicate inclusion in any cube. Am I maybe going off on that? But I kind of feel like I think that Planeswalkers are potentially the card that can make or break archetypes, because they not only have the, but like, look at that card, right? If you've got any reactive...
Wait, let's don't look at that card. Let's look at Chandra.
Look at Chandra.
Torch of Defiance. For 2 colorless and 2 mountains, you get a legendary Planeswalker Chandra. He's making me do the one with all the text. +1, exile the top card of your library. You may cast this card. If you don't, Chandra Torch of Defiance deals 2 damage to each opponent. This next +1 has 2 +1s, and it started out with a loyalty of 4, folks, is add 2 mountains to your mana pool, or 2 red to your mana pool. And then -3, Chandra Torch of Defiance deals 4 damage to target creature. So there's that. It can deal with threats on the board. Mm-hmm. And then the ultimate, and seldom, and we're jumping ahead of our clock in our show notes here, seldom do we evaluate. I mean, people just bypass ultimates like nobody's business. They're like, it's got an ultimate. Not this one. It started out with a loyalty of 4. You didn't have to do a whole lot to clock it up. You can accelerate it in different ways. But for -7, you get an emblem. And for those that aren't familiar with an emblem, it is a static effect that Wizards hasn't quite put out a way to solve. It's a permanent attribute that will be assigned to you as a player. Whenever you cast a spell, this emblem deals 5 damage to any target.
I'm going to go out on a limb real quick and say that one of the reasons why I think that maybe the ultimates on Planeswalkers are probably less considered. I don't want to cause any offense to any of the Cube guys out there, Cube people listening to this and listening to it as a purely Cube. But maybe there's people out there that look at it, they're thinking with it in an EDH mindset.
Yeah.
How often is your Planeswalker really realistically going to reach that ultimate level in a
correct when you got in a multiplayer environment?
It's 100%. Never going to happen.
Yeah,
right? It's not going to happen.
It's the 1v1 evaluation that changes these cards.
But those pluses and those minuses that are available as it hits the ground, those are the ones that are. And you know what? To be fair, even in a cube environment, like, you're not always expecting your Planeswalker to survive the next turn. It doesn't always have to, but the power that you get from it when it does, sometimes that's enough.
So we've now enjoyed Teferi and Chandra, and we've talked about them, but we're now still in the pros context, right? So
finishers.
Some of the pros.
Let's talk about finishers, right? Let's keep talking about pros. Finishers. Okay, so finisher. I'm going to go with one that's a classic. It's Elspeth, Sun's Champion. 4 colors, 2 white. Very straightforward. +1, put 3 1/1 white soldier creature tokens onto the battlefield. -3, destroy all creatures with power 4 or greater. That's pretty strong. So she's either protecting herself if you're not too worried about the ground, because she can just put 1/1 tokens. She's protecting herself because she's literally destroying all the big creatures. But her ultimate, you get an emblem with creatures you control get +2/+2 and have flying. Yes, she's expensive, but that is a finisher.
So to kind of reiterate what he's saying here in so many words, the pros are it sets a clock. It establishes a finisher. It supports multiple archetypes, right? Generates advanced lines of play. These are
more aggro-based.
Yeah, but and it has synergies with a lot of them. We're going to talk about that because we're going to switch back and forth for different types of cube environments.
Sure.
But that's the pros. I'm going to focus on the cons. I'm going to be the killjoy or the antagonist here a little bit. And so a couple of things you have to consider with a Planeswalker. It's not so much a con, but it's a reality check. It's the power level versus the environment. Just because it looks beautiful and you got that foil of the Elspeth and you want to put it in that cube, it doesn't mean it's right for it. It could be overpowered. It could have a lot of different things that really tilt the scales in your environment. And we go back to the old adage, it's only one card, Anthony, right? How could that possibly warp my environment? Well, that's where it starts.
Because it's the one card that whenever I sit down and draft a cube, I am drafting that card every single time. And if I get it pick one, pack one, I'm drafting around it every single time. And that's not going to lead to a
players do that have a spiky type mindset.
Yes.
They don't necessarily announce that to you, but if you have cards that are extreme power outliers, and it's okay to have some that are high ceilings, right? They're power max, they're really pushing the thresholds of your cube. That's perfectly fine, right? In context. You don't want a flat environment. But when you start getting cards that start getting identified as they're just game-winning, game-changing. Sure, in my play group, like I said, we have a lot of people that are very commander-oriented. They're jovial. We're having a good time. We're drinking beers. But every once in a while, somebody puts their hat on backwards and they want to spike. It's just the way, right? I did it last night.
I tend to find myself as being that kind of drafter, right? For the most part, when I'm drafting, I kind of get an early idea of what I want to draft.
Yeah.
Right? I want to force something, but you can't build your cube around the fact that people just want to have fun. There needs to be power and fun need to exist together harmoniously.
A little spike mentality is okay in a smidgen,
absolutely.
right? But when you put a planeswalker in there that's warping or very noticeable or eye-catching, what it can do, just like anything else we talked about before, like the card Soul Ring, and I don't want to tangent too much. If it's so eye-catching that it's skewing your draft choices, that can be a con. Because in certain environments, people might realize that this is just dominating and has dominated. It hurts the player agency inadvertently.
Yes.
Even though they don't realize it's happening, because they're kind of it's getting on rails because the choices are being taken away from them, because the choices are now, it's going to be premium versus, I don't know, the for sale cart that you see at the grocery store. The nickel and dime, right?
Did someone decide to spike tonight and just decide, I want to get that card and I want to just go power max and min max on the draft, you know?
And then some other cons of planeswalkers, and this kind of ties, and we're going to go into the evaluation, but these tie into it. It's going to be thematic decision making, right? Like, this isn't right for my type of environment. Either it's, like I have a horror cube genre and I don't want to put a Johnny Avengent in there.
No, it doesn't fit at all.
It would, because it's awesome, but doesn't really fit my theme I'm trying to do. So that choice wouldn't make a lot of sense from a thematic standpoint for aesthetics purposes, right? And then another one that's going to branch over to the evaluations. A lot of them some of them don't have the ability to protect themselves.
Absolutely.
Protection is going to come in all kinds of shapes and sizes. It's going to be tap down. It's going to be destruction form. It's going to be bounce. It's going to be all kinds of stuff, right? Or blanking them out, whatever it takes. They're all going to be doing stuff. And as we move through and transition into bigger, badder planeswalkers, those abilities are going to go into spectrums we've never even seen before. The next one is the abilities. They may not be relevant at all levels for your environment. That's a consideration. That's a con, right? Like, maybe, let's just say Garruk untapped 2 lands, but that's all all he did. And other than that, did a whole lot of nothing. It wouldn't be a card you would just choose to pay 4 mana for a thing just untap 2 lands, right? Just for a ramp spell. So you have to have something that's relevant and it checks all the boxes. And that's why out of the Lorwyn 5, Garruk is a survivor, because all 3 of them are relevant.
It's so bananas that you can just -1 Garruk and put a 3/3 out, and he still has 2 loyalty. Right?
Yeah, that's why it is still a relevant Magic card.
It's pretty nuts.
In cube environments.
Look at it historically, man. 4 mana for a 3/3 isn't terrible.
But every single thing it does, and then we talked about Chandra and Teferi and all that. Every one of those, what makes them unique is the boxes, when you check them, does something that hits a lot of different either archetypes or control pieces, etc., that makes your cube environment more enriched, right?
Yeah.
If they have duds in them, they get pushed to the wayside. And then we talk about casting cost versus loyalty. It's part of the evaluation that I'm going to migrate over here to very shortly, which I think we've kind of pseudo bled into that. But the cons wise is, that's just something you have to consider. Another thing, and this is in my evaluation piece, but it's relevant to this, is planeswalkers can act as a active fog or additive distraction to the game or a sub game. I don't care if that comes off with a negative connotation so much as the reality.
I like the fog, all right? And the reason why I like the fog is because it requires someone... OP, you need to get rid of this planeswalker.
Or you don't. I mean, you can picture the ants going around the river.
Do I want to?
Or do they go at it?
No, you have to get rid of some of these. And, okay, we spent some time talking about we spent some time talking about broken planeswalkers. We spent some time talking about Teferi Time Raveler. We spent some time talking about Wrenn and 6, right? Or even Jace the Mind Sculptor, right? Those are absolutely must get rid of. Wrenn and 6, because you now can't play a 1 toughness creature. Teferi, because now you can't do anything at instant speed. Jace the Mind Sculptor, because he just represents the end of the game if you can't get rid of him before he gets to 12 loyalty, right? But it's not just a fog, right? Not just the turn that comes down. If you have to just swing your creatures at that planeswalker to get rid of them, and that's all you do your next turn, it's a time walk. Time walk is 1 colorless, 1 blue, take an extra turn. But if all I've done is played a planeswalker and all my opponent has done the next turn is swing to get rid of that planeswalker, then I have got a time walk. And I don't really care if I've spent 3 or 4 mana to do it. The value is incredible, or can be incredible.
I 100% agree. It comes down to, is it just creating something that is drawing away from the gameplay, right? And it's a consideration. If you're putting a Planeswalker out and everybody has to divert their resources to deal with this one thing all the time because it's an outlier.
Time Walk is a great storm spell. Time Walk is an incredible everything spell, right? It's one of the most incredibly powerful spells that have been created in the history of Magic. But Now, Planeswalkers, they do represent that if they're not managed correctly in a cube environment.
And then, which leads us over to our next portion, and it's kind of goes into the con slash. You got to really balance the equation. What is too many Planeswalkers? And again, back to
400.
Yeah.
400
in
is
a
too
400,
many
but yeah.
Planeswalkers.
I mean, a Planeswalker cube might be the most interesting, most boring gameplay I've ever seen.
No, that is the number. Okay, if anyone asks, how many is too many Planeswalkers? It's 400.
It's really difficult when there's only been 275 plus Planeswalkers printed and existent. But once we get to the 400, we'll be able to build this cube.
Okay.
But, so, we talked about the cons. And one of the cons was, are there too many of them? It's not only are they too powerful, but are you saturating your environment with them? It is a consideration because too much of a good thing, it's just like anything else. It could divert the game because a lot of the Planeswalkers, yes, some of them make creatures that may mobilize gameplays. Some of them do interactive gameplay and hurt the player and do cause life totals to transition. But there are periods where some of them just have static effects and it would be like enchantment versus enchantment battle. And I could see that not being ideal. So you really have to balance that equation as a curator. And that kind of comes back to when I looked at the different evaluations. I looked at my cube, and like I said before, I had 28, which is the equivalent of about 5 to 7% of the cube. There's some variation in there because I didn't count all of them. But there's no metric here that I can give you as an advanced statement. You should only run 6%, but I'm just telling you, I looked at a lot of really powerful cubes that I thought qualified, and on average, the max was 7%. I think it's a good, safe number.
And I think power level agnostic, right? You can always make decisions to include cards that are top Planeswalkers. I mean, this might seem like an incredibly obvious statement, right? But there's always going to be a replacement for a Planeswalker card. However, there are always going to be, well, maybe not always, but there are going to be situations where you are developing a cube and you've got your archetypes all laid out and you think, you know what? Maybe it's not the key to the kingdom for that archetype, but maybe it's the card that doesn't really fit anything else. You're not just going to pick up that Planeswalker because it just kind of might work in some of my other archetypes. But you know what? For this one archetype, it just works. It just fills a gap somewhere. It might not be the key. It might not be 100% essential, but it just works.
Like Wrenn and 6 just falls comfortably into a Lands Matters theme, but also does.
I'm sorry, excuse me?
Wrenn and 6?
I don't want to say that Wrenn and 6...
Do you want me to say 7?
I don't want to say Wrenn and 6 just falls into...
Okay, the word just may have been an overstatement, but it's a good shell for it to coexist in.
It is.
And it does control a lot of other pieces.
I would say outside of Vintage Cube, though, if you have Wrenn and 6, I am probably going to force the heck out of that.
So as we've talked about, we've talked about a consortium of Planeswalkers at this point, right? And Super Friends is the reference, right? And to reiterate the Super Friends package in your cube, it can be all shapes and colors, right? It can be America, it can be Teamer to describe those colors, it can be whatever you need, a Golgari. But one of the major pieces to reiterate is, sure, you play a Planeswalker, so either it has the ability to protect itself, or win the game, or control the game, and or you have a lot of wraths, spot removal, control interaction, stuff that basically you want to basically stop your opponent. You want to stymie them until your Planeswalkers just either, frankly, makes them quit the game.
They can win. They can win.
You win, or it closes out the game with some kind of ultimate, right?
Yep.
But I want to tell you a little funny story recently. This is me.
Story time.
Super confident Anthony.
Super Friends story time.
Super Friends, not even, just Super Friend with no S. And I played against Chris Moore. We're doing a little Houseman draft of his powered vintage, I believe it's a 450. We're having a good time. I'm introducing the Houseman draft. I am pretty confident. On the play, I am dropping a land, a swamp. I'm going to hit a Dark Ritual.
Okay.
And into Liliana the Veil.
That's an incredibly
just
fun play.
Start getting it, right? So immediately, +1, tick up. Everybody discard a card. I don't care. I've planned for this. Chris has not. This is where I'm at, right? My brain space like, oh man, I'm doing the spicy. I'm rubbing my hands together like, got him. Keep doing it. He's like, I got no cards. Keep doing it. Got no cards. Oh man, I am getting to the ultimate. Oh my gosh. I'm going to take her all the way. Is it 6, right? I'm going to take her all the way. -6. Get it, Chris. Just get rid. We're gonna separate your piles. We're gonna blow up your stuff. You know who lost? Me. The
What
ultimate
did you separate?
I don't.
Did he have anything?
I think I made some very poor choices. I got wrapped up in the moment. It was the excitement of just the ultimate, like, oh my god! And I wasn't even defending her so much. I was hand stripping. I thought I had a play. And you know what Chris did? He stayed calm, cool, and collected like a cucumber. He was taking his licks. He played to his outs.
I mean,
he watched me hide behind this. We're gonna call it my inflated ego of tick.
You kind of realize
I realized that
it's an incredibly strong
false
ultimate,
false
Liliana
sense
of the Veil. So for those who are not aware, you separate your opponent's cards into two piles. One gets dumped, one gets kept, right? So, but if you have, like, I can imagine, I don't know what kind of deck you had.
It was good, but I thought I cut it to pieces.
Let's say, for example, you have like a mono red deck, and I've just been plowing you. Bang, bang, bang. I've got Monastery Swift Spear. I've got Goblin Guide. I've been hitting your life total down. Yeah, you've been making me, maybe you made me sacrifice a creature, but I'm imagining not because you ultimated it. So you're ticking it up and you're making me discard cards, but each turn I've been able to drop a land and maybe drop a creature. You've been maybe making me discard, like, oh man, I this land would be nice, but I'm going to keep it in hand because it sucks to discard a card at any point, but I don't need that land. So you maybe discard a land, and then you ultimate. It's like, maybe I've got 3 or 4 lands, maybe I've got 2 creatures, but you know what? You've got 3 life, and I top deck a lightning bolt, and you're dead.
This may be. So this was eye-opening for me. This may have been just last week, right? I've been playing Magic for a long time, and it's not the first time I've ultimate Liliana the Veil.
Of course.
But this is the first time where, like, so skill-wise, Chris Moore, he is exceptional player. He's very strong. He's one of the strongest in our bunch, right?
Yes.
And so I've got this little bit of high, right? A little euphoria, like, I'm going to get him. I'm doing the spicy hands, right? And he just stayed cool. And he played to his outs. And I was behind that security blanket that little, I'm holding that little warm, cozy blanket.
Are you making?
And I think I'm going to survive.
Are you making the point?
And he survived it.
But are you making a point that Super Friends has the ability to maybe give people a security blanket that really doesn't exist?
Yeah, some of them, so they give you this false sense of security that they're so powerful that you have to deal with this. I've had people run around Jace Bellerin, right? And I've been on both ends of this mistake. So his his +1 is everybody draws a card. His -1s is it
-1? Yeah, +1 everybody
draws a card. And -1 you draw a card.
Yeah.
And well, I've had a few times where I've made the calculated decision, like, I don't care, man, just draw your cards. I'm gonna run around like, so I'm doing those ants. I learned, right? So it was like those ants going around that river. I don't need to go over the river. I'm gonna go around the river, whatever that means, right? And Jace, the card advantage alone overtook the game. It had nothing to do with anything more than that person was just drawing down and getting card advantage. And I miscalculated it, thinking that I could overtake them with resources. Meanwhile, they're basically, they're actually getting more resources than I am because I'm running a Boros aggro deck thinking I don't have to care about this. So they can create an active fog, an added distraction. They can detract from the game. But at the same time, you can't ignore all of them. No. Some of them must not be ignored.
Yes.
And some of them can cause you to not strike the player, which is an interesting kind of psychological warfare that's happening. I know I need to... Stu's... you can make stupid decisions. Stu's at 6 life, but, oh man, he just played Liliana the Last Hope. I'm going to stop striking Stu with my creatures, and I'm going to divert my... It's kind of a silly... But you understand where I'm going. It could draw you in.
Yes.
And it can also allow players to stabilize amidst the draw-in, right? They're kind of create the fog of war.
Yes.
And that's what's so interesting about
Yes. Like I said, it can be a fog. It can be a time walk. Like, there's so many cool effects.
There's psychological warfare on the battlefield.
I was going to say, some of those effects can be psychological and not just what the plus or the minus effect
You put
is.
these in front of a new player. Welcome to Magic the Gathering. I'm going to play this weird-looking, multi-tiered,
freaking out.
You think you have to crush this with all your being.
I was panicking.
And some of them you must, but some of them you can survive it.
I kind of panicked. I was like, hang on a second. This is like I've got a 2-for-1. Or a 2 versus 1 that I'm facing right now because this player's got all these cards in their hand, and I've got this Planeswalker that's also doing stuff, right? And they're not irrelevant abilities. Like, which one do I choose? Do I attack this one? Do I attack that one? Like, what do I do?
So within the show notes, I've included not only the list form of everything broken down in my cube.
We're not going to talk about these individual.
There's so many of them,
so
right?
many and so many.
I mean, I literally told you I have 28 of them, so I'm going to spare all of you the mental overload here to read these. But you will find in the show notes literally every single card that's in my cube. In addition to, I'll have the cube link that you can refer to. So let's talk about like a different way of using them. So we've kind of talked about the highest tier, we'll say Chill MTG's Sol Cube, where it's a very powerful cube, right? So when he's running them in there, he's running them for the most efficient, the most aggressive, even egregious play lines, right? Yes. They're doing something that is moving the game forward. But sometimes, just sometimes, you can run Planeswalkers that not only on theme, but they're utilitarian even, and they kind of play into an archetype that these are going to be very powerful, but it's in context to the environment, and they're fun.
And I will say, I want to highlight the fun, right? And certainly from the two-headed giant cube, I love, and I will certainly say that I love the two-headed giant cube, because at CubeCon there was a couple of games there where Chill MTG and we played against yourself and our amazing friend Christian Anderson.
We got rolled.
Yeah, you kind of did, but the fun was that these Super Friends, sometimes the incremental value, it is fun. And sometimes just dealing a bit of damage.
They're a little different. So, like, if you're going to a multiplayer context, in the case of a two-headed environment, and I'm still running Planeswalkers, and I run quite a few of them. I don't have the total count right in my notes. But something like Basriket, which I'm not going to read a lot to you, but essentially I'm putting in there because it puts +1/+1 counters.
I'll read it real quick because I don't think this is as
it's an unusual one.
Basriket, 2 colors, 1 white, +1, put a +1/+1 counter on up to 1 target creature, not just you control, but target creature.
Yep.
It gains indestructible until end of turn. -2 whenever 1 or more non-token creatures attack this turn. Create that many 1/1 white soldier creature tokens that are tapped and attacking. And -6, you get an emblem with at the beginning of combat on your turn. Create a 1/1 white soldier creature token. Then put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. Enters with 3 loyalty. Pretty good for a 3 CMC Planeswalker.
And you can see how that can play. Sure, you can run this in a 1v1 environment. You can run this in a very comfortably in a thematic type environment, but also in a two-headed giant cube. The +1 and the -2 effects very much play into that I have a team. And even the ultimate is relevant because you need to go wide strategy, right? It grows. And then other examples, and these will be in the show notes, it'll be a Johnny Adversary of Tyrants, which falls into that. And I want to talk about these 1/1 counters. A lot of this because I run not only a +1/+1, -1/-1 counter, but I also run a proliferation. Very, very in line with like the Carmen Handy proliferation cube, right? So I'm kind of taking a little bit from that. And then we talked about our good friend from the Lore 1/5, Jace Bellerin. And for 1 colorless and 2 blue, you get a Planeswalker Jace. This is the OG, right? With the interesting anime art that I have in here. And you get 3 loyalty. And it's +2. Each player draws a card. So you can see where maybe your partner needs to restock. And then -1, maybe your player has a full grip. Your teammates do sitting to my left versus, say, Chris and Christian sitting across the table, or Chill, right?
Sure.
And we need to get some advantage. I will and I'll target player draws a card. So maybe I don't want everybody, but I want it to survive. And then the ultimate, I hate the ultimate on this card. It's so good, but I don't want it to exist. It's -10. Target player puts the top 20 cards of his or her library into their graveyard.
You know why I love this?
But this card is never intended to be that. It is the uptick and downtick of the draw card.
Exactly. And that's one of the things that I love about Jace Bellerin. It's so simple in its design. It's like
it's elegant.
-1, you're the only one that's getting an advantage right now. +2, everyone is. But oh my gosh, if you get to -10...
Yeah, in a 40...
in a 40-card environment...
I personally dislike Mill with a passion, but I can see where it's strong, right?
I'm not even... What you like about Mill,
Anthony? We're not even going to dissect that. That's for another episode of Anthony's
going to do
visceral hatred of Mill. Not self-Mill, Mill. But you could self-mill yourself, and this would be great again. But I'm all about it. We'll lie on the couch and we'll talk about all the problems that I have.
That's another point. I mean, self-mill, it's target player, right? Self-mill, Labman.
Sure, if you're running some kind of graveyard cube, I could see rocking this, right? You want to mill yourself.
I am playing this in a mono blue Labman. That's his Oracle.
Go for it.
That's what I'm trying.
That's neat. But I think that ultimate really skews the game, right? It has potential to be backbreaking, and it takes.
I think it only does if you've got.
You hope your players have a conscience or a good moral compass as a curator.
Take Labman, take Thassa's Oracle out of your cube. Then what is Jace Beleren? It is make a choice to give your opponent a card as well as yourself, or just yourself get a card. Right? I think the ultimate is quite archetype dependent? Question mark. I don't know. I think I would argue the fact that Jace Beleren is one of the more power level agnostic planeswalkers, in that it's not necessarily going to be a problem if you don't have something that can take advantage of the ultimate. So
we saw another one that we have in here too is I run Will and I run Rowan Kenrith, and we saw them, I believe, come out in Eldraine. I think I got that wrong. They came out in Battle Bond. I could neither switch those two, but these two planeswalkers, they basically found themselves. You had them two together in Eldraine, if I'm not mistaken.
Are they brother and sister?
They are brother and sister. And then they have separate planeswalkers cards that are very powerful that came out during Battle Bond.
Yeah.
And I run them both because they have that partner ability, and it really encourages players in a two-headed giant scenario. Another one that's very interesting is Dovin, Hand of Control. Now, this is kind of the kind of 3 fairy that he alluded to, but for 2 and Azorius Hybrid, you get a 5 loyalty planeswalker. And what I like about these is they came out during the War of Spark. It is a legendary planeswalker, Dovin. And artifacts, instants, and sorcery spells your opponent's cast cost 1 more.
There is a ton.
I think I read that a little goofy, but you get the point.
Well, there's a ton of uncommon rarity level planeswalkers that came out in War of the Spark that are very, very close to the structure of Dovin as far as a super friend, right? So no plus ability. So you don't have a way to increase the loyalty counters, but you do have a -1 ability that gives you like this incremental advantage each turn. Pretty cool.
And this one exemplifies, when I said the word active fog, this one actually shows what I'm trying to say in so many words, because it literally does it. -1 until your next turn, prevent all damage that would be dealt to and dealt by target permanent and opponent controls. And that's really neat in a two-headed giant environment, because there's a lot of stuff that does static effects of damage, etc.
Yep.
And it really controls the riot, I guess, coming at you.
Agreed.
But it does the one thing that Anthony's been screaming the whole time: active fog, active fog. So we kind of move on to the next one. We talked about before, we did the MTGO analysis, and I'll have this in the show notes. You'll find 32 planeswalkers of their 540. It falls within that percentile of the 5 to 7 that I had discussed
previously. Couple of changes between your vintage environment and the Moto vintage environment, but
correct.
Nothing that's like,
They run Ashiok and they run Kaito Shizuki. They're both neat, but I don't run them currently.
I think Kato's a cool card.
Is it Kato? Yeah.
Kato. I will say that I think Ashiok Nightmare Weaver, again, another card. We'll include it in the show notes. I think we have it in the show notes. If not, check it out. I think it's a bit of an underappreciated card in the room that I'm in right now. I know there's a lot of people that like this card. I do myself. Pretty powerful. But I can understand it's not a instantly impactful card right when it lands. So not a card I would ever fault someone for not including in a cube. But for the most part, you've got your typical what you would expect to see: your Lilianas, Narsets, Chandras, Garrux, Teferis, Elspeths, Gideons, that kind of stuff. So
yeah, kind of the expected Super Friends we saw in War of the Spark, right? And so what the player wants to do, to just kind of tie it off, is they want to drop these planeswalkers, they want to control the playing field, and they want to decisively choose how this game is going to be played to the OP, right?
Exactly.
They're going to be taking out your threats. They're going to be, you know, in a Johnny Vengeance, blowing up your lands. They're going to be ultimating with Chandra of Defiance and just hitting you for 5 every time they cast a spell.
Or getting that recurring
They're going to be doing
value.
Jace. You never even get to play because they keep bouncing your stuff.
That's
they
the
get
recurring
card
value.
advantage,
Yeah,
right? Recurring.
exactly.
These you can run Grist, but what they're
Ren
going
and
to
Six.
we didn't talk about Oko.
Fairy.
Oko Thief of Crowns, which is just at this point infamous for what it has done to so many structured environments. And
It's crazy. You know what? Let's talk about that just for a second. We have just done a whole Super Friends episode. We've been recording for about an hour. We have not mentioned Oko once.
Yeah.
Why have we not
we
mentioned...
loathe this card,
why?
but love it at the same
I
time.
love Oko, but why have we not mentioned Oko?
That's a good point because I'm on team Minx and Boo and a Johnny
Vince
Vengeance.
Boo is incredible.
I love them, and whereas Oko Thief of Crowns at this point, I think has just so much infamy tethered to the idea of the card and what it did to so many constructed environments. I do run this in my powered vintage environment. This is one of those cards that I would say, unless your environment can handle it, I do not recommend running this card outside of the highest tiers of Magic. And again, reiterating, that is a subjective tone. No one wants to hear that my cube is not powerful, but subjectively to the entire genre, the entire gameplay of Magic, there are tiers. I mean, we do acknowledge that. Using Ancestral Recall as being like power max nonsense, Soul Ring, power max nonsense. That's where Oko sits. Oko doesn't sit down here where I'm running Signets just because I run them because they're powerful, or some kind of Goblin Welder because it's awesome. It's a whole different type of play. It's competitive, super high tier play versus I want to run something that's fun but super strong. Oko is a threat to a lot of environments.
It is.
The only time that Oko, I believe,
It can win games by itself.
interesting thing about Oko, and we don't want to hark on Oko too much because it's a horrible card. We did play a game of Commander one
I
time.
think it's a good case study, though.
We did. We played Oko. Oko, just what's attached to the idea of Oko, right? So Stu is playing Oko in a game where he drops the card and there's 3 other players, right? And he turns someone's thing into an elk. And it just draws...
And it was, let me clarify.
Yeah, it didn't make any sense what happens next.
I did elk a creature that was a legitimate board threat, not just a single person threat. It's like, we need to get rid of that card because that's going to be either a pain in the butt or an unfun card for the rest of the table, right? So I'm going to get rid of that. I'm going to kind of... And I hate to be like, I'm going to do everyone a favor. Look at me. I'm like, you know, I'm the good guy here, which I generally don't tend to do. But I'm going to do everyone a favor. I'm going to pay 3 mana. I'm going to play Oko. And that creature right there that's going to be a pain in the butt, it's gone.
And he dealt with a threat that was a threat to the entire
What
table.
happened, Anthony?
The emotional response came online.
Yes,
just because the infamy that's been attached to the idea of Oko Thief of Crowns and all the stories that are attributed to it. And people lost their minds. I didn't. I enjoyed what happened next. People began to...
I don't even think you got to have a turn before it was wiped off the battlefield.
No, they just started.
Weapons.
They started attacking as if he just declared war on the table when all he did was use it as a really not great removal spell.
Which I will say, and for clarification, this is a Tasigur commander deck that I play. It's a combo deck, but one of the reasons why I keep Oko in the deck is for that exact reason, is because every time I land it, everybody freaks out.
It drives home that active fog idea that
it's
I'm
like,
saying.
I don't care how many resources, what I have to do to get this Planeswalker off the battlefield, I'm going to do it. And I'm sitting there thinking, I've got a combo in my hand. I am more than happy for you to like tap your mana and attack your creatures against that Planeswalker, because I might win in the next turn or two, and you've spent all this time and effort, resources, and whatever into getting rid of this one Planeswalker that really, after it's done that, especially in a 3-4 player environment, it's kind of done after that point.
It creates additive distraction.
But like you say, and Tasigur, anyone that plays a Tasigur EDH deck will know that it can be a very political commander. You don't have to worry about that necessarily in Cube when you're playing a 1v1, but that's the kind of reaction that people will get when they see a Planeswalker like Oko. But we're not just limited to Oko. We could be looking at, again, Teferi Time Reveler. We could be looking at Ren and Six, or Chandra, or Jace the Mind Sculptor. There is always going to be that emotional reaction to those Planeswalkers, to those Super Friends, that can either skew things, it can make things awkward, it can be a positive experience, but definitely something to consider.
So let's talk about a different experience. We did the pros and cons, we've done the Super Friends and what that means, but let's talk about when they might not be right for your environment. So maybe they're just such a high pick that they distract or they skew the draft experience, that you've noticed repetitively that people keep grabbing, I don't know, in my very not so powerful environment, but I decided for the lulz, I'm running Jace the Mind Sculptor. And for whatever reason, I'm not registering the fact that this is an uber powerful card, and they just keep snagging it all the time. I mean, It's going to inadvertently warp the entire game, even the sub game of drafting cards.
I'm telling my if I show up and someone says, "Hey, would you like to draft my cube?" and I say yes, and that card is there, I'm going to tell them, certainly after the draft, and say, "Hey, I'm going to pick that card, and I'm going to come pick it every single time I draft."
And we've done this with a good friend of ours that has we'll talk about this in a future episode, where it has a mono-colored cube, mono-white. And I drafted mono-white Planeswalkers, and I 3-0'd multiple times. It wasn't, and I did bring to the surface that I think this is a problem. We talked it out, and it tweaked and tuned from there. But there's no reason for me to let Gideons go around the table. I drafted Gideons and Elspeths, and they're very powerful. And then just combine them with a couple of Wraths, and I'm in business, right? And it was definitely in the cube, intended to be in the cube. I just happened to really put on my spike brain for whatever reason this particular night, and that's what I gravitated towards.
I drafted that cube, and I will confidently say that I did not get past a single Planeswalker.
I grabbed them all.
And I'm sure you grabbed all of them, and I'm sad because I would have loved to take every single one of them that came my way.
Yeah, and then another one is I put in the notes, I put color preferences based on power level. So, like, there can be a skew on, like, you have to figure out if you want to give too much of a pie, too much power. Like, maybe blue has some iteration of a Jace it may not seem as strong, but it's really warping the environment, but maybe you didn't give the green section the option to even have that. So I really believe in kind of trying to not only balancing the environment, but balancing the level of Planeswalkers, which I did in my La Femme Fatale ish. I do have some things I've done in there. I do have Chandra, Torch of Defiance, which probably is too strong. I acknowledge that.
Let's draft it and find out.
I'm certain that it's too strong. I don't know why it's in there, but because there wasn't a red Planeswalker that represented that particular thematic thing that I wanted to put in there in the color red.
As a super friend, I think that Chandra, Torch of Defiance is probably
too much. It's probably too much.
Chandra's up there.
I'll check it. And then that kind of summarizes kind of the pros and cons. But when it came to back to the question, the core question is it right for your environment? Let's talk about my Artifact Cube. Artifact Cube, I don't run any Planeswalkers. And people have oftentimes asked me, Anthony, why do you not run Planeswalkers in your Artifact Cube? Well, because it goes back to that skew. The ones that are super uber powerful that do the most effects typically are in red, blue, or colorless. And that'll be an example, be like Duretti. Any Duretti for that matter.
Or green.
Or any.
What about Oko?
But green will be an anti, and Oko's not thematic with a ish. It's ish. It makes a food, but that's a real stretch. I'm not going to do it.
Really?
Yeah, I'm not 100%.
Karn creates colorless constructs.
The construct. It's because in my mind, it's such a high pick, especially Karn. Karn Cyanoversa for 4 colorless
is a high pick.
High pick. Warping.
Do you have Karn in your cube?
Yeah, powered vintage.
Do you have Karn in your Artifact Cube?
Absolutely not. I run no Planeswalkers in there.
Okay.
Because they skew the choices for the players inadvertently.
I agree. So this might be a little bit of an unplanned discussion, but let's roll with it. Karn is not in your cube, which I fully understand. Do you know why I wouldn't put Karn in your cube?
Why?
There's one reason why I wouldn't put Karn in your cube. Because it's colorless. Only reason.
It's so open. Open.
Way too open.
And again, that skews the draft choices.
Way too open.
It doesn't even...
You're never not going to choose a card that you can literally just pay 4 mana and then just spit out twice artifacts, construct tokens that can be absolutely gigantic. Oko, on the other hand, is 2 colors. 2 colors, right?
Yeah.
It's green and blue.
It feeds the machine, but doesn't... It warps the game, but less warping than even a Karn. Let's talk about a case study. I run a Goblin Welder. Goblin Welder is a safe choice compared to what I'm about to do next. Duretti the Scrap Servant. And for 3 colorless and 1 mountain, you get a legendary Planeswalker, Duretti. And for 3 loyalty, enters the battlefield. It's +2, very powerful. Discard up to 2 cards, then draw that many cards. Nice, powerful looting
Agreed.
effect. -2, sacrifice an artifact. If you do, return target artifact card from your graveyard to the battlefield.
Pretty strong.
Goblin Welder-ish, but one-sided. I get it. Not
Very,
quite
very
Goblin,
strong.
but very powerful when you've done this exchange rate, right?
Absolutely.
You've originally dumped them, now you're feeding them in there. It is so uber powerful. And then the emblem, I'm not even going to bother with it. None of that matters. It could be your commander. None of that matters. It's that broken Goblin Welder looting. There's no reason why you would ever choose Goblin Welder. Not really. Versus a Duretti. That's
Really?
why I choose.
Goblin Welder costs 1 mana.
But it comes into play. It's got summoning sickness. I get. Just follow my flow here.
So I've got it available on turn 2.
Oh, sure. Goblin Welder is uber powerful. No arguments there whatsoever.
Yeah.
But Duretti, it just creates like this emotional response that maybe it's going to make choices be taken away inadvertently from your drafters, because there's no reason in a artifact cube environment you wouldn't get the word Duretti, Tezzeret, or Karn Scion of
You can also
Urza.
Goblin Welder at instant speed. You know that, right?
I do, but
I'm like going to keep
follow my-
throwing these reasons why Goblin Welder is in another universe
it's
compared to
a
Duretti
disgusting
Scrap
card.
Savant.
You got zero argument. But
Please check out, again, as we've mentioned,
Show
please
notes.
check out the show notes. Duretti Scrap Savant, 3 colors, 1 red, +2, discard 2, draw up to that many, or draw that many. -2, sack an artifact, and then return target artifact card from your graveyard to the battlefield. -10, whenever an artifact is put into your graveyard from the battlefield, return that card to the battlefield at the beginning of the next end step. Goblin Welder absolutely is ridiculously powerful, vintage level powerful. I don't know if I want to put that on the same plane as a super friend like Duretti.
comparatively speaking, the point is that there's not always a necessity to run these.
100%.
But sometimes you might want to run them for different reasons. And it may be for power maxing, it may be for utilitarian. It's a decision. Do I want to finish with this card? Do I want to control the game? Or do I want to add some added benefit like we talked about with the two-headed giant?
I can see it for a graveyard, like I want to get things from the graveyard onto the battlefield.
Sure.
Kind of thematic cube, it'd be pretty cool. I'd run both of those.
It's choices. It's always choices as the curator, and you have to ask yourself, is this healthy? Is this right for my environment? And the biggest question, and this is my personal, is it fun? The most subjective idea I've ever said, but it is a consideration when you're making these choices. Not only fun, but are your players going to have fun? Is it going to create an experience that is so positive or game warping that it could make people not want to sit down at the table again or make them want to come back, right?
Okay.
You're literally selling an attraction, right? Come play my cube.
Understood. So when you are designing, creating your cubes, who are you designing and curating them for?
My players.
Right. So that is your play group?
That is. But I've expanded that horizon. Truthfully, my ideas, because of not only the podcast, but because the growing people. Like, I think May said this at one point, more viewership, more people are, critiquing my cubes. I'm being held to a standard that may or may not be present. At least I'm taking this as internal decision making. That I am really making decisions that I think are beneficial to the community as a whole.
I would hope that you are.
Yeah.
I would hope that you are, especially now that you are a curator of multiple cubes. You are also doing a podcast, right? We're sitting here recording this, and we are hoping to give good advice and promote the format, right? So you want to be responsible, right? I think that's
I'm evaluating cards on that level.
Exactly.
Like not only am I thinking, Chris and Stu and anybody that sits down and play my cube, are they going to have a great time? But also thinking, when I go to CubeCon in 2023, are people going to have fun? And get whatever their definition of fun, whether they're Spike or Timmy or whatever that might be, whatever they're going to pull from it. I'm thinking about this at a multi-tier level on a huge spectrum that I never have before.
And that's incredible, right? And again,
makes my brain hurt sometimes.
Yeah, and we've recorded this as a Anthony definitely more of the curator, and myself, like I'm building 2 cubes at the moment. I won't shed any.
One's a cowboy cube. He's going to pretend like it's not happening.
But I definitely, as a enjoying playing them. Right, those kind of aspects of the design are so important. They're so critical to the fun aspects. Right, that is what this format is about. Right, it has to be about fun. Sure, I like to win. Sure, I like to draft a very, very powerful deck. But the job and sort of the responsibility of the curator is not just to create power. It's to create fun. It's to create balance. It's to create an environment that makes the drafters want to come back.
It's a little, not to be egotistical. That's not. But it's a little.
Egotistical.
But it's a little selfless. The opposite of egotistical. It's a little bit like, I'm making a game. I want others to gain enjoyment from said game, right?
Yes.
I want my players to have fun. Even just when we drafted Chris Moore's Peasant Cube last night, his mantra the whole time is, I don't care if I lost. Did you have fun? That's an attitude. That's a way of thinking. That's how you think, right? Did you have fun playing this game? Do you want to play it again?
Yep.
Right? It's game changing to think that way. So that kind of ties off the Super Friends. So one more time, last time, Super Friends. It is dropping Planeswalkers, controlling the field, doing either some kind of control, game-changing effect, and or utilitarian effect, managing all aspects of the game to include wraths and spot removals and hand stripping, whatever you got to do to stymie OP from not taking out the Planeswalkers and or distracting them.
Distracting them.
Pop and smoke.
Giving yourself a powerful but generally not game-changing, ability, not right when they land, to that. And I cannot emphasize that enough. Anthony, you keep talking about it, and I want to keep emphasizing it. The psychological effect of the Planeswalker. It's so powerful. Certainly in a 1v1 environment where that opponent is thinking, I don't want to deal with that anymore.
So kind of in summary, right? Planeswalkers can be really fun. But you got to make a lot of considerations. So one of them is evaluating, is it right for your cube? How many do you need? There's no perfect number. We said 5 to 7%. That is a ever-changing value. That's a sliding scale. There's no rubric to make you solve this equation, right? Considerations when you're evaluating them is the mana value, the loyalty count, the ability to protect itself, the relevance of the abilities to the environment and or archetypes, right?
And does it skew the draft? Is that a card or cards, depending on how many you have in your cube? Are those cards going to be, I am going to pick those up. I am going to skew my draft regardless of what I've got previously. I absolutely must pick those cards up because I know without a question that those are the most powerful cards in the cube.
Correct. And then power outliers like Oko and Jace and Chandra Defiance and Three Fair. We talked about these are powerful cards. They're strong. But they may scale. They may have a paradigm shift based on the. I mean, it is possible that
they might be too powerful.
But they might be. But maybe you can handle it. And then when is a Planeswalker too powerful is always a question you ask yourself. And maybe it's not even something you ask yourself. You ask your players, hey, what was your experience with this version of Duretti? What do you think about? Did this warp my artifact cube if I'm running it? Yes or no? Honest opinion.
And maybe that's a great point. Maybe that's the one card type, right? That you maybe need to get the most feedback from when it comes to the draft and your players, right? If the Planeswalkers were drafted, which I would assume they would, because typically for myself, outside of Vintage Cube, which typically I tend to look less at the Planeswalkers, but in most other environments, I'm looking at the Planeswalkers as a pretty high priority pick, right? Ask your players, how much impact did you think that Planeswalker had? Did you draft a Planeswalker and it was just an all-star? Did you draft a Planeswalker and you felt that maybe wasn't just the right for the archetype that I drafted? Or was it that you drafted it and thought, man, I even tried to draft around it and it kind of didn't fit the archetype that I was trying to draft or the power level that I was trying to draft at, or whatever the case may be. I feel like that is the one card type that maybe is going to benefit from the most amount of feedback from your players.
And then ask your question to the players, were you hiding behind this Planeswalker? What was your intent, right? Did you play this as an active
there's anything
fog?
wrong with that.
Did you do this as a game distraction?
I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with hiding behind
There's nothing wrong. Were you popping smoke to get me to miss your alternative motives of what you're trying to do with gameplay? Maybe. If you're willing to volunteer that. It's a good question. It's
not necessarily a bad thing either. Like the Planeswalkers, those super friends, they are friends. They sit beside me on the plane, right? They are there for a good reason. And they are typically costed at a point where they need to be something that's dealt with by my opponent. I don't want them to just sit there and, okay, they've had one effect and now, my opponent doesn't care about them. Then I might as well have just casted an instant, which was typically a little cheaper for the initial effect that I got, right? So I want them to have an effect after just the +1 or the -1. So again, that sort of ties into, the consideration of it being on the field, the effect that it has when it first enters.
And then the quantity of Planeswalkers is something we emphasize. There's no magic number here, but when I ran...
Apparently there is. It's 5 to 7% or 8%.
Ish. It's varying number, right? It's just you have to decide if you tilt the scales too much on is the gameplay still moving forward? Are the armies marching? Are people diverting their resources to deal with this on a consistent level, right? And then you have to ask yourself, is it appropriate at all for my environment, right?
I like that. Is it appropriate at all? Should you include them?
When should I include them? In the case of Artifact Cube, didn't feel as appropriate, didn't feel like it gave a additive benefit to my environment. And then one more thing before we move on, and this is close. I want to give a shout out to my boy, Tybalt the Fiend-Blooded. Poor little guy. This could have been the greatest Planeswalker of all time.
But it's not.
But it can be. I want to hear, I do truly want to hear, is there a cube environment where somebody's running Tybalt and you've somehow found a way, made it amazing? I'm dying to know.
And I want to...
Is there an amazing experience with this card?
I want to hear a couple of things. Number one, the all-stars in your cube, right? And not necessarily the vintage cube. In fact, I don't really care about the vintage
Don't care about the vintage cube at all.
I want to hear about your all-stars in your thematic cubes, right? Hit us up on the Twitters, right? I want to hear your all-star Planeswalkers that don't skew the environment, that create a fun experience. Tell us the Planeswalker, tell us the vibe, tell us the theme of the cube, right? Tell us what's an all-star for you, right? Because I think that's incredible for not just us, but for other cube curators to hear, right? What are the all-star super friends that really do add so much to your drafting experience?
Yeah, fortune favors the bold, man. I'm not going the populace. A Johnny Vengeant, that card is busted. Not loved. People think it's not that.
I don't think it's busted.
That card will warp a game.
I don't think it's busted.
I'm gonna hold my guns on that one. I do believe that card is fantastic. All right, so we're moving over to the socials. If you love the show, and we would truly appreciate a 5-star review on your favorite player. If you want to support the show, please use our Inked Gaming affiliate, where we have all the access to all the things you love and need for your cube environment. That includes playmats, dice bags, mouse pads for your computers, etc. I buy all my playmats, especially, and I have way too many playmats.
You do.
I do. I buy them from Ink Gaming. That'll be included in the show notes. Please consider supporting the show by using that link that'll be provided in the show notes and as well as on the Buzzsprout website. In addition, you can find us at Twitter at UberCubeMTGPod, or you can reach us at UberCubeMTGPodcast at gmail.com, or you can link us on Discord, #UberCube. Amazing discussions happening there. Great, just social network happening. And then if you want to help us, and we would very much appreciate it, we have a Patreon landing page at UberCube you can check out with the nice suites. We're looking for your feedback. Other than that, we're going to do the thing that we always do here at UberCube, and we're going to say, Happy Cubing!